The alarm in the vault screamed before I even understood what my hands had touched. My name is Elior Vance, and until that moment, I was nobody important. I was a junior archivist for the Celian Compact, assigned to catalog the ruins of a species that had been dead for 11,000 years. My job was quiet. My job was safe. My job was supposed to be boring. Then the floor lights turned red, and every screen in the vault chamber flickered with the same 3 words, translated into 40 different dead languages, over and over, like a chant that refused to stop. They are dreaming. I stood frozen with my scanning tool still raised, my heart slamming against my ribs. The vault around me had been sealed for longer than my entire species had known how to write. It belonged to the Ithkal, a civilization so old that even their bones had turned to dust before my grandmother's grandmother was born. I had been sent here to catalog broken pottery and rusted machines. I had not been sent here to wake something up. But that was exactly what the warning felt like, a thing waking up. I lowered my tool slowly, as if sudden movement might make the message angrier. The chamber was silent except for the low hum of failing power cells and my own uneven breathing. Dust drifted through a beam of light from my headlamp, frozen in the air like it, too, was afraid to move. I had seen warnings before. Every dead civilization leaves warnings. Most of them are meaningless by the time we find them, corrupted by centuries of decay, chewed up by radiation, turned into static and guesswork. My professors had trained me to expect nonsense, fragments, half a sentence about a plague, a drawing of a weapon nobody could identify anymore. This was not like that. This was clear. This was deliberate. This was the same 3 words in 40 different languages, which meant somebody wanted to be absolutely certain that whoever found this message, no matter where they came from or what they spoke, would understand it. I forced my hands to move again, this time toward the console instead of away from it. My training told me to document everything, no matter how frightening, because documentation was the only thing that mattered in my line of work. Frightened archivists still had reports to file. I connected my scanner to the ancient console and began pulling every fragment of data I could find. The system fought me, not with defenses, not with any weapon I could detect, but with age. Half of the drives had rotted into uselessness. Entire sections of memory returned nothing but blank static. It took almost 3 hours of careful, patient work before I had anything resembling a complete file. What I found chilled me more than the warning itself. The Ithkal had not been destroyed by war with each other. Their own records made that clear. There was no invasion, no civil collapse, no natural disaster large enough to erase an entire civilization. Instead, the records spoke of contact, first contact, according to their own language, with something they called the sleeping kind. I read those words a dozen times, waiting for them to make more sense. They never did. The sleeping kind, whatever that meant to the Ithkal, they clearly believed it was important enough to encode into the deepest, most protected vault of their civilization, sealed behind mechanisms that had taken me and 2 support engineers nearly a full day to open. I sat back in my chair, staring at the console, feeling very small and very far from home. My name is Elior Vance, and I want to be honest about something before I continue this account. I was not brave that day. I did not feel like a hero making a great discovery. I felt like someone who had opened a door they were told never to open, and now had to decide what to do with what they had seen. I did what any frightened, ambitious young archivist would do. I kept reading. The file continued. According to the fragments I could recover, the sleeping kind were not conquerors. They did not arrive with weapons blazing or fleets darkening the sky. They arrived quietly, almost gently, and made contact through simple signals, the same way any curious species might reach out to a neighbor. The Ithkal welcomed them. Their records described excitement, celebration. An entire civilization thrilled at the idea that they were not alone in the galaxy.
Then, according to the last surviving fragments, everything went silent. Not destroyed, not burned, silent.
The final entry in the vault, dated in a calendar system I had to cross-reference with 3 other archives to even translate, was not a battle report or a distress call. It was something closer to a confession, written by someone who sounded exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "We made a mistake," the entry read. "We thought their quiet meant peace. We thought their patience meant weakness. We were the ones who moved first, and now we understand why every warning before ours told us not to. The entry ended there. Whatever happened after that moment, the Ethcall never had the chance to write it down, or if they did, that record had been lost to time long before I arrived. I sat in that vault for a long while after finishing the file, turning the words over and over in my mind. Every dead civilization leaves warnings, my professors always said, as if it were simply a fact of history, the way objects leave shadows in sunlight. I had cataloged dozens of these warnings throughout my short career, most of them blurred together into vague fear and superstition. This one was different because it was specific. It named something. It pointed somewhere. I pulled up the coordinates embedded at the very end of the file, half expecting them to be corrupted like everything else. They were not. They were perfectly intact, as if someone had wanted to make absolutely certain that whoever found this warning would know exactly where to look, and exactly where not to go. The coordinates led to a small, unremarkable yellow star, a star I recognized instantly, not because it was famous, but because it was the opposite. It was a star that appeared on every compact star chart, with a quiet, unofficial note attached to it, one that every navigator and archivist learned early in their training and rarely thought about twice. Avoid. No explanation, no history, just a single word, repeated across 1,000 years of compact records, attached to a star system that held, as far as anyone had ever confirmed, nothing of interest at all. No valuable resources. No strategic position. No known threat. Just an empty system that the entire galaxy had quietly agreed to leave alone. I remember laughing under my breath at the coincidence, the kind of laugh that comes out when your body doesn't know whether to be amused or afraid. Of all the civilizations I could have been assigned to study, of all the vaults and all the ruins across 1,000 dead worlds, I had ended up here, staring at a warning that pointed directly at the one place everyone had been told to avoid, without ever being told why. I copied the coordinates onto a secure drive and shut down the console, sealing the vault behind me exactly as I had found it. My hands were steady by the time I stepped back out into the cool evening air of the excavation camp, but my mind was anything but calm. That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, running the numbers over and over in my head. 11,000 years since the Ethcall vanished. A dozen other extinct civilizations cataloged in compact archives, each with fragments of their own warnings, most dismissed as superstition or corrupted data. I began pulling old records on my personal terminal, cross-referencing anything I could find about extinct species and unexplained silences. What I found kept me awake until the sun rose. Civilization after civilization, spread across different star systems, different eras, different languages, all left some version of the same warning behind. Not identical wording, but identical meaning. A species emerges. A species reaches a certain level of technology. A species makes contact with something quiet, something patient, something that does not announce itself with force. And then, without fail, that species goes silent forever. I want to be clear that at this point in my life, I did not believe in monsters. I believed in bad data, misunderstood translations, and coincidence stretched too far, by frightened scholars looking for patterns that were not really there. I told myself that story again and again as the night wore on, trying to convince my racing heart that there was nothing more to this than an old ghost story shared by dying civilizations who simply could not accept that extinction sometimes has no explanation at all. But somewhere underneath that comforting lie, a smaller, quieter thought kept surfacing, one I could not quite silence no matter how hard I tried. What if they were all telling the truth? By morning, I had made a decision that would change the rest of my life, though I did not fully understand that yet. I decided I would request access to the full historical records surrounding that yellow star system. Not because I believed in ghost stories, I told myself, but because a good archivist follows evidence wherever it leads, even when the evidence makes them uncomfortable. I submitted my request through official channels, expecting the usual slow bureaucracy that governed everything in the compact. To my surprise, a response came back within hours, not from my immediate supervisor, but from someone several levels above her, a senior official named Director Halbrook, whose name I recognized only from formal briefings I had never personally attended. The response was polite, professional, and completely unhelpful. Access denied, citing an old compact policy regarding sensitive border regions. No further explanation provided. I read the message twice, feeling a strange mixture of disappointment and relief. Perhaps this was the universe telling me to leave well enough alone, to file my report on the HFY vault, and to move on with my quiet, boring career. I almost did exactly that. Then, 3 days later, everything changed again. A new message arrived, this time directly from Director Halbrook's office, informing me that my request for access had been reconsidered and approved. Not only approved, but expanded. I was being offered command of a small survey mission, a single ship with a modest crew, tasked with investigating the exclusion zone surrounding the yellow star and reporting back anything of scientific value. I remember staring at that message for a very long time, feeling something cold settle in my stomach even as excitement bloomed in my chest. Every instinct I had ever developed as a careful, methodical archivist told me that something about this sudden reversal did not make sense. Denials from officials that high up the chain did not simply reverse themselves within a few days without a very good reason. But I was young, and I was ambitious, and I had just spent a career cataloging other people's discoveries instead of making my own. The chance to lead a mission, however small, into a region of space that no one had properly investigated in living memory was more tempting than any warning I had read in that ancient vault. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself I would proceed carefully, document everything, and turn back at the first sign of genuine danger. I told myself a great many comforting things over the following weeks, as preparations for the mission moved forward with unusual speed, faster than any bureaucratic process I had ever witnessed in my career. Looking back now, I understand that speed should have frightened me more than the warning itself. Someone, somewhere in the Compact's highest offices, wanted this mission to happen quickly and quietly. I was simply too eager, too flattered by the sudden attention, to ask the questions that might have stopped me before I ever left the ground. The night before departure, I returned to the HFY vault one last time, alone, without informing my supervisors. I stood in that same chamber, where the warning had first flashed across the screens, and I read the final confession one more time, letting the weight of those words settle fully into my chest. We thought their quiet meant peace. We thought their patience meant weakness. I did not know it then, standing in that cold, dark vault with dust drifting silently through my headlamp's beam. But I was about to make the exact same mistake that had ended an entire civilization 11,000 years before I was born. I was about to mistake a warning for an invitation, and patience for permission. My name is Elior Vance, and this is the account of what happened when I stopped listening to the dead and went looking for the thing they had spent 11,000 years trying to warn me about. I had no idea, that night in the vault, that the warning was not really about a place at all. It was about a choice, and I was about to make it. The next morning, under a pale, indifferent sky, I boarded a survey vessel named the Halden Marrow, alongside a crew of 6 who trusted my judgment far more than I trusted it myself. As the engines came online and the ground fell away beneath us, I found myself thinking not about the discoveries I hoped to make, but about that single word stamped across 1,000 years of star charts: avoid. I had spent my entire career learning to read the messages the dead leave behind. I was about to learn, in the most terrifying way possible, that some messages are not meant to be studied. They are meant to be obeyed. The journey to the yellow star took 11 days, and every one of them felt longer than the last. I had commanded small teams before, but never a full survey mission, and never one shrouded in the strange, uneasy silence that settled over the Halden Marrow almost as soon as we left orbit. My crew of 6 were professionals, each hand-picked for this assignment, though I would later wonder exactly who had done the picking. There was Owen Blackwood, our pilot, a steady man with a dry sense of humor that seemed to fade a little more each day we traveled closer to the exclusion zone. There was Clara Whitfield, our science officer, sharp and curious, the kind of person who asked questions I had not thought to ask myself. There was Henry Voss, our engineer, quiet and thorough, always checking systems twice, even when nothing seemed wrong. I remember the first time Clara asked me directly why we were heading toward a region, every star chart in compact space, marked with a single silent warning: We were sitting in the observation deck, watching stars slide past the viewport, and I gave her the answer I had rehearsed in my mind a dozen times already. Scientific curiosity, I told her. An old civilization's records pointed us here, and it was our job to investigate anomalies wherever they appeared. She studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly, the way people do when they sense there is more to a story than they are being told, but decide not to press further. I appreciated her restraint, even as it made me feel a little more ashamed of my own dishonesty. The truth was that I did not fully understand why we were heading there myself. I only knew that something ancient and long dead had been frightened enough to encode a warning across 40 different languages, and that fear alone was reason enough to worry. Each night during that journey, I found myself returning to the recovered files from the Ithkal vault, reading them again and again, as if repetition might reveal some hidden detail I had missed the first dozen times. The confession at the end always struck me the hardest. We thought their quiet meant peace. We thought their patience meant weakness. I began to understand, somewhere around the 6th day of our journey, that this line was not simply describing an event. It was describing an error in judgment, one so costly that an entire civilization had been erased because of it. I started keeping a private log, separate from my official mission reports, recording my own thoughts and fears as honestly as I could. I do not know if anyone will ever read these words besides myself, but I felt that if something happened to us, if the Halden Marrow became another entry in some future archivist's catalog of the lost, then at least there would be an honest account of how we got there, and why. On the 8th day, Henry detected something unusual on our long-range sensors, still many hours away but clear enough to draw everyone into the command deck at once. A debris field, scattered across a wide stretch of empty space at the very edge of the yellow star's system. Not asteroid fragments or natural rock, but metal, manufactured metal, twisted and broken, drifting in slow silent orbit around nothing in particular. Clara ran the scans twice before she was willing to speak. The debris, she finally announced, matched the composition of an automated listening post, the kind older civilizations sometimes placed at the edges of dangerous or unstable regions to monitor activity without risking crewed vessels. Except this one had been destroyed, its remains scattered across kilometers of empty space, and judging by the decay patterns in the wreckage, it had been sitting there, broken and silent, for a very long time. Nobody spoke for a long moment after she finished her report. I remember looking around the command deck at the faces of my crew, watching the same question form silently behind each pair of eyes. Something had destroyed that listening post. Something had been powerful enough, or determined enough, to reach out into the emptiness of an exclusion zone and silence a piece of equipment. I gave the order to proceed with caution, though I recognized even as I said the words how hollow they sounded. We had already traveled 8 days into a region the entire galaxy had agreed to avoid. Caution, at this point, felt like closing a door after the storm had already come inside. We reached the debris field on the 9th day, and Owen guided the Halden Marrow through the scattered wreckage with careful, deliberate movements, giving each piece of twisted metal a wide berth, as though it might still be dangerous after however many years it had drifted there in silence. Clara catalogued fragments as we passed, occasionally calling out details in a voice that grew steadily quieter the longer we lingered among the ruins. It was Henry who spotted it first, on the 10th day, half hidden behind the largest cluster of wreckage, sitting motionless against the black backdrop of open space. A ship. I remember the way my breath caught in my throat the moment the image resolved clearly enough on our view screen for me to understand what I was looking at. It was unlike anything I had studied in my years cataloging the ruins of dead civilizations. It was not sleek. It was not elegant. It bore no obvious ornamentation, no symbols of pride or culture painted across its hull the way most ships I had encountered proudly displayed their origins. It looked, more than anything else, like something built by a species that had long ago stopped caring about how their creations looked, and cared only about whether those creations worked. Every surface seemed layered with additions, reinforcements bolted over older sections, weapon systems integrated so seamlessly into the hull that I could not immediately tell where the ship's body ended and its armaments began. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of our modest survey vessel, and utterly, completely still. Clara's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Life signs negative. Power signature minimal. but present, not dead, sleeping. I felt a chill move through my body at her choice of words, though I said nothing, unwilling to give voice to the thought already forming in the back of my mind. They are dreaming, the exact phrase from the ETH-call warning, echoed now by my own science officer describing a ship that should have looked abandoned, but somehow did not. Owen brought us to a careful stop at a respectful distance, and for a long while, nobody on the command deck spoke at all. We simply stared at the view screen, watching that motionless vessel drift silently among the wreckage of whatever had once tried to watch it from a distance. I want to describe, as honestly as I can, the feeling that settled over me in that moment, because I believe it matters more than any technical detail I could report. It was not the fear of an obvious predator, the kind of instinctive terror that comes from staring down something with teeth and claws, and clear violent intent. It was something quieter, and somehow worse. It was the feeling of being watched by something that had not yet decided you were worth waking up for. I ordered Clara to run passive scans only, nothing that might broadcast our presence more than our arrival already had. She complied immediately, her hands moving with the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to make any sudden noise in a room where something dangerous might be sleeping nearby. The scans took several hours to complete, and I spent that time reviewing every fragment of the ETH-call records one final time, searching for any detail that might help me understand what we were looking at. I found nothing specific, no direct description of a ship or a species, only that same haunting confession repeated in different forms throughout their final records. They arrived quietly. We celebrated. Then everything went silent. By the time Clara's passive scans completed, the sun outside our viewport had shifted just enough to catch the edge of that alien hull, illuminating details we had not been able to see before. Scarring across the surface, deep and old, patterns that looked almost like the marks left behind by countless small impacts, absorbed over a very long time. Whatever this vessel was, it had clearly seen conflict before, and it had clearly survived that conflict without needing repairs elegant enough to hide the evidence. Henry finally broke the silence, his voice careful and measured in the way engineers speak when they are trying very hard not to sound alarmed. "Captain," he said, using the title I still did not feel I had earned. The power signature just changed. I turned to the view screen so quickly that I nearly knocked over the console beside me. The ship had not moved. Its position remained exactly as it had been for the entire duration of our approach. Somewhere deep inside that ancient, scarred hull, something had shifted, some system coming online that had not been active moments before. Clara's fingers flew across her console, her earlier caution replaced by urgent focus. "Minimal change," she reported after a tense moment. "Consistent with a passive sensor sweep. It's scanning us back." I remember the exact sensation that moved through my chest at those words. A strange mixture of dread and something almost like relief. Whatever slept inside that vessel was not entirely unaware of our presence. It had noticed us, quietly, the same way we had been quietly studying it. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps this encounter might unfold gently, two cautious strangers studying each other from a respectful distance, neither one willing to make the first aggressive move. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took Clara to finish her next sentence. "The scan has stopped," she said. "No further activity detected. Power signature returning to previous levels." I exhaled slowly, unaware until that moment that I had been holding my breath. Owen glanced back at me from the pilot's station, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the same unspoken question in his eyes that I imagine was written plainly across my own face. "What do we do now?" I did not have a good answer for him. Every instinct I had developed as a careful, methodical archivist told me to withdraw immediately, to record what we had found, and to return home with a report recommending that the entire region remain exactly as undisturbed as it had been for however many centuries the Compact had wisely chosen to leave it alone. But I had also spent my entire life studying warnings left behind by the dead, and I understood something about warnings that I think many people overlook. A warning is not simply a description of danger. It is also, whether intended or not, an invitation to understand exactly what that danger is. Every civilization that had left behind fragments about the sleeping kind had done so not merely to frighten future generations, but because some part of them, even as they faced their own extinction, still wanted someone, somewhere, to to finally understand what had happened to them. I made a decision that night, alone in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, exactly as I had done on the night before we departed. I decided that we would attempt one careful, minimal, respectful form of contact. Not a weapon, not an aggressive maneuver. A simple scanning pulse, the same gentle handshake protocol my team had used 100 times before on the ruins of dead civilizations, designed specifically to be as unobtrusive and non-threatening as technology allowed. I told myself this was caution. I told myself this was careful, measured scientific process. Exactly the kind of methodical approach that had built my entire career. I did not allow myself, that night, to fully consider the possibility that I was making the exact same mistake described in the Ithkal's final confession, mistaking a sleeping giant's silence for permission, and its patience for an open door. I gave the order the following morning, the 11th day of our journey, with a steady voice that did not entirely match the uncertainty churning beneath my calm exterior. Clara looked at me for a long moment before her hands moved to comply, and I will never forget the quiet reluctance in her voice as she confirmed the command. "Sending scan now, Captain," she said. "I hope you're right about this." I hoped so too. I had no way of knowing, in that moment, that the ancient scarred vessel drifting silently before us was about to answer that single gentle pulse in under a single second, in a language none of us had taught it, addressed directly to me, by a name it should never have known.
The response arrived so quickly that at first I believed our equipment had malfunctioned.
Clara's console lit up with a cascade of incoming data less than a full second after our scanning pulse touched that ancient hull, and for one confused moment, everyone on the command deck assumed we were experiencing some kind of feedback loop, our own signal bouncing back distorted by the debris field surrounding us. Then Clara's face changed, the color draining from her cheeks as she read the incoming information more carefully. "It's not an echo," she said, her voice tight with something between fear and disbelief. "It's a direct transmission. Structured, deliberate." I moved to her station immediately, watching over her shoulder as lines of text scrolled across her display, resolving with impossible speed into something we could actually read, my own language. Chilean, translated with a precision far beyond what our own systems could have managed on the fly, formatted exactly the way a careful, respectful correspondence might be written between two civilized parties. And at the very top of that transmission, addressed with chilling specificity, was my own name. To Elior Vance, Junior Archivist of the Celian Compact. I remember staring at those words for a long moment, feeling the blood drain from my face just as it had drained from Clara's. Nobody outside of the Compact's own internal records should have known my name, let alone a species we had never before encountered, drifting silently in a region of space every star chart warned us to avoid. I had introduced myself to no one. I had broadcast nothing beyond a simple scanning pulse, designed to carry no personal information whatsoever. Yet here it was, addressed to me specifically, as though whatever slept inside that ancient vessel had been waiting for this exact moment, and had already known, long before we arrived, exactly who would eventually come looking. Owen turned in his seat, his usual dry humor entirely absent from his expression. "How?" he asked simply, the question hanging in the air like a held breath. I did not have an answer for him. I still do not have a complete answer even now, looking back on everything that happened afterward. Perhaps our earlier passive scan had revealed more than we realized. Perhaps something in our approach, some detail buried in the make and configuration of our humble survey vessel, had told this ancient intelligence everything it needed to know about who might eventually come knocking. Or perhaps, and this thought frightened me more than any other explanation, our arrival had simply been expected for a very long time, the specific details filled in only once we were close enough to identify. I forced myself to keep reading, my hands trembling slightly against the edge of Clara's console. The transmission was not a threat. It contained no demands, no warnings of imminent destruction, nothing resembling the aggressive posturing I might have expected from a species capable of scarring their own hull through countless small conflicts and reducing an automated listening post to scattered wreckage. Instead, it contained history. Not our history. Not the Celian Compact's carefully curated records of galactic events. This was something older and far more disturbing. A detailed accounting of civilizations I recognized instantly from my own research, presented with a clarity and completeness that our own archives had never managed to achieve. The HFY War, described not as the vague, fragmentary tragedy I had spent years trying to piece together from broken data drives, but as a complete narrative, beginning to end, written by someone who had clearly witnessed the entire event firsthand. The Korvath silence, another extinction I had only ever encountered as scattered rumors among compact scholars, now laid out in careful, almost clinical detail. 4 other civilizations followed, each one a name I recognized from the margins of academic papers, each one described with the same unsettling thoroughness. And in every single account, the same pattern repeated itself with unbearable consistency. A human vessel, arriving not before the destruction, but after, documenting, recording, occasionally leaving behind warnings for whoever might come next, the exact warnings I had spent my entire career studying, without ever understanding their true origin. I sat down slowly in the chair beside Clara's station, feeling the weight of what I was reading settle over me like something physical. My entire understanding of these ancient warnings shifted in that moment, cracking apart and reforming into something far more disturbing than superstition or corrupted data. These were not simply messages left behind by frightened, dying civilizations trying to make sense of their own extinction. These were reports. Documentation, gathered and distributed by an outside observer who had witnessed each of these tragedies unfold, and who clearly possessed both the patience and the reach to ensure that these accounts survived across thousands of years, embedded deep within the most protected vaults of civilizations, who had no idea they were being watched. Clara's voice pulled me back to the present moment. "There's more," she said quietly. "It keeps going." I leaned forward again, forcing myself to keep reading, despite the growing dread coiling tighter in my chest with every new paragraph. The transmission continued past the historical accounts, shifting into something that read less like a report and more like an explanation, directed specifically at whoever eventually found themselves standing exactly where I now stood. The exclusion zone was never meant to protect visitors from a threat, the message explained. It was meant to protect a tired, grieving watcher from provocations it had learned, through painful repetition, to misinterpret as hostility. Every civilization listed above had approached this region believing themselves to be cautious, careful, respectful of boundaries they did not fully understand. Every one of them had eventually made a small, seemingly harmless gesture that had been read, correctly or incorrectly, as the opening move of aggression. I read that section 3 times before its full weight settled into my understanding. The exclusion zone was not a cage built to contain something dangerous. It was a fence built by something exhausted, trying desperately to prevent yet another misunderstanding from ending in yet another extinction. Owen's voice broke the heavy silence that had settled over the command deck. "What happened to those civilizations exactly?" he asked carefully. "Does it say?" I scrolled further through the transmission, searching for a direct answer, and found one buried near the end of the historical accounts, described with the same clinical, almost weary precision that characterized the rest of the message. Contact was made. Signals were misread on both sides. Defensive actions, taken by frightened, uncertain species trying to protect themselves from something they did not understand, were interpreted as the beginning of conflict by a watcher who had already lost too much to risk, waiting for clarification. What followed, in every single case, was swift, and it was final. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of what we had stumbled into settle over me. We had traveled 11 days into a region of space specifically marked to be avoided, guided by a warning left behind by a civilization that had made this exact mistake 11,000 years before us. And now, having ignored every signal telling us to turn back, we had sent a scanning pulse toward a vessel that history itself described as capable of ending entire species when it felt cornered or threatened. Henry's voice, quiet and careful, cut through my racing thoughts. "Captain," he said, "I'm reading a change in the vessel's power signature again. Larger this time, more sustained." I opened my eyes and looked toward the view screen, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The ancient ship, which had remained utterly motionless throughout our entire approach, was beginning to shift, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence I had half expected, but with the slow, deliberate movement of something waking from a very long rest, testing its own limbs before deciding whether it needed to use them. I turned back to the transmission, still scrolling across Clara's console, searching desperately for some final piece of guidance, some instruction that might tell us how to avoid becoming the seventh entry in this terrible history we had just uncovered. I found it in the very last line of the message, shorter and more direct than everything that had come before it, as though whoever composed this transmission understood that after everything else had been explained, only one simple, urgent request remained truly important. Do not repeat their mistake. Do not mistake our silence for permission, or our patience for weakness. Whatever brought you here, whatever you hope to find, leave quietly, and leave now, before something happens that none of us will be able to take back. I stared at those words for a long moment, feeling the full, crushing weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders. 6 lives depended on whatever decision I made in the next few minutes, and beyond that, potentially the fate of my entire species, if this ancient, weary watcher decided that our small survey vessel represented the beginning of yet another misunderstanding it could not afford to risk. I opened my mouth to give the order to withdraw immediately, to turn the Halden Marrow around and retreat from this region as quickly and quietly as our engines could carry us. That was the exact moment Henry's console erupted with a new alert, one that had nothing to do with the ancient vessel drifting before us, and everything to do with 3 additional signatures suddenly translating into the system behind our own ship, their configuration unmistakably military. 3 compact warships. Full military configuration, translating in system less than 100,000 kilometers behind our own modest survey vessel. I stared at the readout on Henry's console, feeling a cold, sinking dread replace the fear I had already been carrying for the past several minutes. This was not a rescue mission. This was not reinforcement sent to protect a survey team that had wandered into dangerous territory. The configuration Henry described, heavy armor plating, forward weapon arrays, already charged and ready, was the unmistakable signature of an attack formation, arriving with a speed and precision that suggested careful, advanced planning rather than any hurried emergency response. Clara turned from her station, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and dawning horror. "Captain," she said carefully, "those ships weren't part of our mission profile. Nobody informed us of a secondary force." I already understood, with a clarity that made my stomach twist painfully, exactly what had happened. Director Halbrook's sudden reversal, approving my petition within days after initially denying it, had never been about scientific curiosity or academic discovery. It had been about opportunity. Someone far above my clearance level had seen my request for access to the exclusion zone and recognized immediately what I, in my naive ambition, had failed to consider. A civilization capable of surviving encounters that had ended 6 other species entirely represented something far more valuable than academic knowledge. It represented power, technology, weapons systems potentially centuries beyond anything the compact currently possessed. I had been used. My careful research, my honest scholarly curiosity, had been quietly redirected into serving as bait, a small, unthreatening survey vessel sent ahead to locate and provoke a reaction, while a proper military force waited just far enough behind to follow our exact coordinates the moment we confirmed contact. Owen's voice cut through my racing thoughts, tight with barely controlled alarm. "Captain, orders," he said urgently. "What do you want me to do?" I forced myself to focus, pushing aside the anger and betrayal churning inside my chest, in favor of the immediate crisis unfolding around us. The ancient vessel before us had already begun to stir, its systems shifting from dormant to active in response to nothing more than a single gentle scanning pulse. I could only imagine how it would interpret the sudden arrival of 3 fully armed warships appearing directly behind the ship that had just made contact with it. I opened a channel to the incoming vessels immediately, my voice steadier than I felt as I demanded identification and explanation. The response, when it finally arrived after several agonizing seconds of delay, confirmed every fear I had been trying desperately to suppress. Director Halbrook's own voice crackled through our communication system, calm and measured in a way that felt almost insulting given the danger his arrival had just introduced into an already volatile situation. "Captain Vance," he said, using my title with a faint note of condescension I had not noticed during our earlier correspondence. Your survey mission has served its purpose admirably. Compact forces will now take custody of the situation. Please withdraw your vessel to a safe distance and allow proper authorities to proceed. I felt anger flare hot and sudden in my chest, momentarily overwhelming the fear that had dominated my thoughts since the ancient vessel first responded to our scan. You used us, I said, not caring how my voice sounded over the open channel. You knew what was out here. You knew the danger, and you sent us in first without a single word of warning. Director Halbrook's response carried no apology, no acknowledgement of the deception at all. Sacrifices are sometimes necessary for the advancement of the compact, he replied simply. Your discovery will be remembered favorably, Captain Vance, regardless of how this proceeds from here. I did not have time to respond to the callous finality of that statement, because at that exact moment, Clara's console erupted with a fresh cascade of alerts, and the ancient vessel drifting before us finally, fully, completely woke up. I watched through the view screen as that scarred, weathered hull began to shift with sudden purpose, systems illuminating across its surface in patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of a predator rising from rest the moment it senses danger approaching. Whatever passive, patient watching it had been doing throughout our slow, cautious approach ended in an instant, replaced by something far more alert and far more dangerous. Henry's voice cracked with barely restrained panic. Captain, weapon systems just went active. Full power. It's not targeting us. It's turning toward the warships. I felt my heart stop entirely for one long, terrible moment. Everything the ancient transmission had explained, every historical account of civilizations mistaking silence for peace and patience for weakness, was about to repeat itself directly in front of me. Except this time, I understood exactly what was happening as it unfolded, powerless to stop it. I opened every channel simultaneously, broadcasting toward both the approaching warships and the awakening vessel with equal desperate urgency, though I had no way of knowing whether either side could even hear me clearly enough to matter. Stand down, I shouted, my careful, measured captain's voice abandoned entirely in favor of raw, honest fear. This is a misunderstanding. Nobody here intends harm. Please, before anyone does something that cannot be taken back. Director Halbrook's warships did not respond to my plea at all. Instead, I watched with growing horror as their formation shifted, weapons arrays rotating to bear directly on the ancient vessel, clearly interpreting its sudden activation as an aggressive threat requiring immediate neutralization, exactly as the transmission had warned would happen. I understood, in that terrible frozen moment, that I was witnessing the exact chain of events described in 6 separate historical accounts, unfolding now for the 7th time, except this time the frightened, uncertain species making the fatal first move was my own. Clara's hands flew across her console, her voice climbing higher with barely controlled panic. Captain, the ancient vessel is moving. It's not fleeing. It's advancing directly toward the warships. I watched, frozen with horror, as that massive scarred hull began to accelerate, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for something that had appeared completely motionless only minutes before. This was not the sluggish, uncertain movement of a machine, slowly rebooting after a long period of dormancy. This was the fluid, confident motion of something that had clearly done this before, countless times, and had long ago stopped needing to think carefully about how to do it efficiently. Owen's voice cut through the chaos on the command deck, tight and urgent. Captain, orders, please! Do we withdraw? Do we intervene? What do you want me to do? I looked from the view screen, where an ancient, awakened vessel accelerated toward 3 fully armed compact warships, to the communications console still open to Director Halbrook's silent, unresponsive channel, to Clara's terrified face, awaiting instruction I did not know how to give. Everything I had studied throughout my entire career as an archivist, every warning I had ever catalogued from the ruins of dead civilizations, suddenly felt less like abstract historical curiosity and more like a countdown I had somehow failed to notice ticking toward 0. I made a decision in that moment that I still cannot fully explain. Even now, looking back on everything that followed, I abandoned every protocol, every careful, measured procedure my training had ever taught me, and I did the only thing that felt honest in a situation built entirely on decades of dishonesty and misunderstanding. I opened a direct channel toward the ancient vessel itself, the same channel that had somehow, impossibly, addressed me personally only minutes before, and I began speaking as plainly and honestly as I possibly could, with no idea whether anything I said would matter at all. "My name is Elior Vance," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through every part of my body. "I did not send those warships. I did not know they were coming. Whatever happens next, please understand that at least one of us out here never wanted this to become another entry in your history." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened at all. The ancient vessel continued its steady, unstoppable advance toward Director Halbrook's formation, and I began to believe that my words had simply vanished into empty space, unheard and unheeded, just as irrelevant to the coming conflict as I clearly was to Director Halbrook's grand ambitions. Then, impossibly, the vessel's advance slowed. Not stopped, not reversed, but slowed, just enough that I felt a fragile, desperate flicker of hope rise in my chest for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun. Clara's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Captain," she said, "it's responding to you. It's actually responding." I did not let myself celebrate that small, fragile hope, because I understood immediately that a slowed advance was not the same thing as a resolved crisis. Director Halbrook's warships continued their own approach, weapons still trained on the ancient vessel, apparently unwilling to interpret its hesitation as anything other than a tactical pause before a larger, more devastating strike. I opened the channel to Director Halbrook once more, my voice sharper now, carrying an authority I did not entirely feel but desperately needed to project. "Order your ships to stand down immediately," I said. "It is responding to communication. This does not need to end the way you clearly expect it to end." Director Halbrook's response finally came, and for the first time since our earlier exchange, I heard something beneath his calm, measured tone that might have been uncertainty. "Captain Vance," he said carefully, "that vessel has just demonstrated weapon capability far beyond anything in our current arsenal. Standard protocol requires neutralizing an active threat of that magnitude before it can act against us." I felt fury rise hot and immediate in my chest, momentarily burning away the fear that had gripped me for the past several minutes. "It is not a threat," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the open channel. "It is a survivor. It has survived exactly this kind of misunderstanding 6 times before, and every single time, the outcome was the same. Whoever moved first against it did not survive the encounter." There was a long pause before Director Halbrook responded again, and in that pause, I watched through the view screen as the ancient vessel's advance slowed further still, hovering now at a careful, deliberate distance from the 3 warships, weapons still fully active but no longer accelerating toward confrontation. I do not fully understand, even now, what convinced Director Halbrook to finally reconsider his position. Perhaps it was the historical accounts I had briefly summarized in my urgent transmission. Perhaps it was simple caution, a recognition that a vessel capable of surviving 6 previous conflicts represented a genuine risk not worth the reward he had originally imagined. Or perhaps, and I like to believe this possibility more than the others, some small part of him recognized the same truth I had come to understand over the past several harrowing minutes, that we were standing at the edge of a mistake that could not be undone once made. Whatever his reasoning, Director Halbrook's voice finally carried the order I had been desperately hoping to hear. "All vessels, stand down weapons and maintain current position. Do not advance further without direct authorization." I felt relief flood through my body so suddenly that I had to grip the edge of Clara's console to steady myself. The 3 warships, their weapons array slowly powering down from full readiness, held their position exactly where they were, no longer advancing, no longer posing the immediate threat that had nearly triggered a catastrophe only moments before. The ancient vessel, in response, came to a complete stop as well, hovering silently between our small survey ship and the now motionless warships, its own weapon systems remaining active, but no longer targeting anything in particular. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened at all. 3 separate parties, each with vastly different levels of power and vastly different histories with this exact kind of encounter, simply hung motionless in the emptiness of space, none of us entirely certain what should happen next. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. her voice carrying a note of cautious wonder beneath the lingering fear. "Captain," she said quietly, "we're receiving a new transmission. Audio only this time. Direct channel. Addressed specifically to you." I nodded slowly, feeling my heart rate climb once more, as I gestured for her to open the channel. Whatever waited on the other end of that transmission, I understood that the next few moments would determine whether this entire encounter ended peacefully, or whether it became the seventh entry in a history I had spent my entire adult life studying without ever truly understanding. The voice that came through, when the channel finally opened, was unlike anything I had expected. It did not sound mechanical or synthesized, the way I might have anticipated from an ancient, long-dormant vessel awakening after centuries of silence. It sounded, more than anything else, simply tired. Not weak, not defeated, but exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue and everything to do with something far deeper and far more painful. "We don't wake up for wars anymore," the voice said, speaking in careful, measured Celian that carried just the faintest trace of an accent I could not immediately place. "We wake up for grief. Tell me you're not here for our graves." I felt those words settle over me with unexpected weight, carrying a sorrow I had not anticipated from a species capable of the kind of devastating history described in the earlier transmission. This was not the voice of a conqueror, gloating over its own power. This was the voice of something that had lost far more than it had ever gained, standing watch over losses so significant that even the act of waking up required justification. I chose my next words as carefully as I possibly could, understanding with sudden, absolute clarity that everything depended on what I said in this exact moment. "We are not here for your graves," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling I felt throughout my entire body. "We came looking for answers about our own dead, and we found instead a warning we did not fully understand until it was almost too late. I did not know about the warships behind us. I did not send them here to threaten you. If given the chance, I would take back every decision that led us into this moment, except for this one, right now, where I am finally telling you the truth." There was a long pause after I finished speaking, long enough that I began to fear my words had somehow failed to convey the honesty I had tried so desperately to communicate. Clara glanced at me nervously from her station, and Owen's hands hovered uncertainly over the controls, ready to respond to whatever came next, but uncertain what response might even be appropriate. Then the voice spoke again, quieter now, carrying something that might have been the very beginning of cautious, fragile trust. "I have heard those exact words before," the voice said, "from 5 different species, standing exactly where you stand now, meaning them exactly as sincerely as you seem to mean them. Every single time, something behind them acted before words could finish mattering." I understood immediately what the voice was describing, and I felt a fresh wave of dread settle over me despite the temporary halt in hostilities we had managed to achieve. Sincerity, however genuine, had never been enough to prevent the tragedies described in that earlier transmission. Words alone had never stopped a frightened, uncertain species from making the exact mistake that led to their own extinction. I looked toward the view screen, toward the 3 motionless warships still hovering at the edge of this fragile standoff, and I understood that the true test of everything I had just said was not going to be decided by my words alone. It was going to be decided by whether Director Halbrook, and whoever waited above him in the Compact's highest offices, could resist the temptation that had apparently doomed 6 civilizations before us. "I am going to ask something of you," I said carefully, addressing the voice directly. "I am going to ask my own people to withdraw completely, to leave this system entirely, and to never return uninvited. I cannot promise you they will listen. I can only promise you that I am asking, honestly, and that I will do everything within my power to make certain they understand exactly what is at stake if they refuse." The pause that followed felt longer than any silence I had experienced throughout this entire harrowing encounter. I stood frozen, waiting, my entire body tense with the understanding that everything, my own survival, my crew's survival, potentially the survival of my entire species, hinged on whatever response came next, from a voice that carried the weight of 6 previous extinctions within its careful, measured words. When the voice finally answered, it did not sound triumphant, or relieved, or anything close to the emotions I might have expected from a being who had just been offered the very thing that might prevent another extinction. It sounded, instead, cautiously curious, as though it had genuinely not expected to reach this particular point in the conversation. "Ask," it said simply. "I will listen to what they say in return." I did not waste a single moment before opening the channel back to Director Halbrook, my voice carrying an urgency I made no attempt to disguise. "Director," I said, "full withdrawal, immediately, all 3 vessels. This is not a request I am making lightly, and I promise you that everything I have learned in the past hour justifies this decision completely." The silence that followed felt far longer than the few seconds it likely took for Director Halbrook to consider his response. I understood, waiting through that agonizing pause, that his decision would depend on factors far beyond my own limited authority, weighed against ambitions and calculations I would probably never fully understand. When his voice finally returned, it carried none of the earlier confidence I had noticed during our first exchange. "Withdraw, Captain Vance," he said, the words clearly costing him something significant to speak aloud. "All vessels, immediate full retreat. Return to standard patrol coordinates and await further instruction." I felt relief flood through my entire body, so completely that my legs nearly buckled beneath me. Through the view screen, I watched as the 3 warships began their slow, careful retreat, engines flaring, as they reversed course and moved steadily away from the ancient vessel that had so nearly become the catalyst for yet another devastating misunderstanding. The ancient vessel remained motionless, watching the retreat unfold with what I imagined, though I had no real way to confirm, might have been cautious relief matching my own. Its weapon systems remained active throughout the entire withdrawal, ready to respond instantly if the retreat proved to be anything other than genuine, but no further aggressive action followed from either side. It took nearly 20 minutes for the warships to fully clear the debris field surrounding us, their signatures gradually fading from our sensors as they returned to whatever patrol routes Director Halbrook had assigned them before this entire crisis began. Throughout that entire waiting period, nobody on the command deck of the Halden Marrow spoke above a whisper, as though raising our voices too loudly might somehow undo the fragile peace we had just barely managed to secure. Once the warships had fully departed, the voice returned through our open channel, quieter now, carrying something that sounded almost like weary gratitude beneath its careful, measured tone. "You kept your word," it said. That has not always happened, historically speaking. I felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering sorrow at those words, understanding fully the weight of history behind such a simple observation. "I am sorry for what happened to the others," I said honestly. "I am sorry that it took this long for someone to actually keep their word." There was a pause before the voice responded again, and when it did, I heard something shift within its tone, a decision being made that I would not fully understand until several moments later. "I am going to share something with you," it said. Not a threat, and not simply history repeated again. Something closer to an explanation, the kind we rarely have the chance to offer before misunderstanding ends the conversation permanently. Clara's console lit up moments later with a substantial incoming data transfer, far larger than the historical accounts we had received earlier. I watched as she carefully began downloading the file, her expression shifting from cautious relief to something closer to fascination as the data continued streaming in. It took several minutes for the transfer to complete, and throughout that entire time, the ancient vessel remained motionless before us, its weapon systems finally beginning to power down now that the immediate threat had fully withdrawn. I found myself studying that scarred, weathered hull more carefully during those quiet minutes, understanding now that whatever civilization had built this vessel had endured losses far greater than I had originally appreciated, and had somehow continued standing watch despite that grief, century after century, waiting patiently for encounters that far too often ended in tragedy rather than understanding. When the transfer finally completed, I began reading through the file with Clara's help, both of us working carefully to translate sections that our own systems struggled to render clearly. What we found within that file changed my understanding of everything I thought I knew about the ancient warnings I had spent my entire career studying. The warning was never truly about a place, the file explained, echoing sentiments the voice had already shared, but expanding upon them with far greater detail and context. It was never simply a message telling frightened species to avoid a dangerous region of space. It was, more accurately, a warning about patience, and about how easily that patience could be exhausted by repeated, painful misunderstanding. The file described, in careful, thorough detail, a species that had emerged from its own homeworld many thousands of years before any civilization currently active within the compact had even developed basic space travel. This species, which the file referred to only as a designation I struggled to translate, but which seemed to mean something close to the watchful ones, had experienced enough conflict and loss throughout its own early history that survival itself had become deeply, permanently intertwined with vigilance. They did not seek out other civilizations for conquest or expansion, the file explained. They sought them out because they had learned, through their own painful history, that isolation itself represented a dangerous vulnerability, and that understanding one's neighbors, even distant, unfamiliar ones, remained essential to long-term survival. Their approach to first contact, however, had been shaped by centuries of their own internal conflict, leaving them perpetually alert to signs of aggression that other species, less scarred by their own history, might never have intended to convey. I read through account after account of civilizations that had approached this exclusion zone throughout the millennia, each one making small, seemingly reasonable decisions that had ultimately been misread as the opening moves of conflict. A scanning pulse, interpreted as a probing attack. A survey vessel's cautious approach interpreted as a scouting mission ahead of a larger invasion force. Each misunderstanding, however small and however innocent its original intention, had eventually spiraled into confrontation that ended, without exception, in devastating loss for the civilization that had made the initial approach. The file's final section, however, offered something I had not expected to find among such a painful, difficult history. It offered hope, carefully qualified and clearly born from hard experience, but hope nonetheless. Every encounter is different, the final passage read. Every civilization that approaches carries its own history, its own fears, its own capacity for either understanding or catastrophic misjudgment. We do not wish for extinction to remain the only possible outcome of contact between ourselves and those we encounter. We continue watching, and we continue waiting, hoping that eventually, someone will approach with enough patience and honesty to finally break this terrible cycle. I closed the file slowly, feeling the full weight of everything I had learned settle over me, with unexpected clarity. The exclusion zone, the ancient warnings scattered across a dozen extinct civilizations, the scarred and weathered vessel now drifting quietly before us. None of it represented the simple, obvious danger I had originally assumed when I first discovered that chilling message flashing across a vault console 11 days ago. It represented instead an old and exhausted patience, stretched thin by repeated tragedy, still somehow persisting despite every reason it might have had to give up entirely on the possibility of peaceful understanding. I opened the channel one final time before we began our own journey home, my voice carrying a sincerity I hoped would matter as much as my earlier promise had mattered throughout this entire encounter. "Thank you," I said simply, understanding that no elaborate speech could adequately capture everything I felt in that moment. I am going to make certain my own people understand what almost happened here today, and I am going to do everything within my power to ensure it never happens again. The voice's final response, when it came, carried something I had not expected to hear from a being who had witnessed 6 previous extinctions unfold from exactly this same position. It carried something that sounded, unmistakably, like cautious, fragile hope. "Then perhaps," it said, "this particular history will finally have a different ending." We withdrew from that system slowly and carefully, the Halden Marrow retracing its own path through the debris field with far more caution than our original approach had demonstrated. I watched through the view screen as that ancient, scarred vessel gradually shrank behind us, eventually returning to whatever quiet, patient vigil it had maintained, for however many centuries it had been standing watch over that empty, forgotten corner of space. My name is Elior Vance, and I returned to compact space not with the triumphant discovery I had originally hoped to make, but with something I believe matters far more. I returned with an understanding, hard-won and deeply humbling, that the ancient warnings scattered throughout our archives were never simply superstition or corrupted data. They were the accumulated, desperate wisdom of civilizations who had learned, too late to save themselves, exactly how dangerous it can be to mistake patience for weakness and silence for permission. I filed my official report exactly as honestly as I could manage, knowing full well that some within the compact would prefer a very different account of what had happened. I described the ancient vessel, the historical files it had shared with us, and the fragile, hard-won peace we had managed to secure through honesty rather than force. I made certain to include, in careful detail, exactly what had almost happened when Director Halbrook's warships arrived uninvited, hoping that record alone might prevent some future officer from making the same catastrophic mistake. I do not know, even now, whether my report will change anything about how the compact approaches that quiet, watchful corner of space in the years ahead. I do not know whether some future archivist, decades or centuries from now, will find themselves standing in a vault very much like the one where this entire journey began, reading my own account with the same fear and fascination I once felt reading the Ithkal's final confession. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is this. Somewhere out past that quiet, exclusionary border, something ancient and exhausted continues standing watch, carrying grief far older than my entire civilization, hoping against a long, painful history that someone, eventually, will finally understand the difference between silence and absence, between patience and permission. Every extinct civilization we have ever catalogued left behind the same warning, repeated across a dozen different languages and 1,000 years of accumulated fear. I understand now, having lived through the exact encounter that warning was always trying to prevent, that it was never truly a warning about monsters waiting in the dark. It was a warning about grief, and about how carefully, how respectfully, that grief deserves to be approached by anyone brave enough, or foolish enough, to go looking for answers in the quiet places the rest of the galaxy has agreed to leave undisturbed.